This is Chris of Punk and Paisley, and I'm introducing a series of what's going to be 10 videos. Working title is 9 Underrated Bands of the 1960s, or perhaps we could say 9 bands, 9 groups who are kind of written out of the history of the 1960s from the critical perspective. I believe that to be a mistake. Using a model for what I'm talking about would be our friends, the Monkees. Hey, they're the Monkees. And people said they monkeyed around, but in fact, once you get past the early prefab stage of the Monkees, which itself is still good music, there was a critical reappraisal of the Monkees beginning, I'd say probably in the mid-1980s, that you see on Rhino compilations in the liner notes, their inclusion on things like Nuggets. Basically a reassessment of the Monkees, that especially the era in which they start doing their own things, they start branching out and being a little bit more serious about their music, actually playing their own instruments and that sort of thing. That there's a lot to appreciate with the Monkees, and I do believe that there's been a critical reappraisal of them. So they're not on my list of 9, but I'm using them really as a model. And I have a few criteria. We're going to have to define a few terms if we're going to have this conversation or argument, however you'd like to term it. First off, what do I mean by the 1960s? Obviously, musically, you can't say 1960 to 1969 is the 1960s, because musically and culturally, that's just not true. The first few years of the 1960s are still basically an extension of the 1950s, both culturally and from a musical perspective. The working definition that most people have is that sometime around the period of the Kennedy assassination, so late November of 1963, into the heart of Beatlemania and the Beatles' appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, which I believe is February of 1964, somewhere in there we could say that the 60s begin culturally. When do they cut off? That's a little bit harder to say. I don't have as clear a working definition from when the 60s cut off, but what I'm actually going to do is just use December 31st, 1969, which is not entirely accurate, and is actually not even going to be entirely fair to a few of these groups who continued to have hits into and through 1970 and 71 and still had a sound that we would associate with the 60s. But let's just to put caps on things and to be nice and neat about it, mainly going to focus on the period 1964 through 1969. And we might throw a little bit of 1963 in there, especially if it's closer toward the end of the year and seems to be consistent with the band's oeuvre. We have 2 criteria, one of which is that this has to have been a band that had actual sales. That is sort of written out of the history of the music of the 1960s by critics, despite the fact that they sold well. They actually had a market presence, and I would argue that many of these bands, even though you don't usually hear that in the critical narrative, actually did have an impact on the music that you like that came afterward, because they were on the radio. This is before the internet. They were on the radio, they were in the record store. This is what kids were actually listening to. It's what young people were actually listening to. And they had an impact. And I don't think that these bands always get credit for the impact that they had. So they had to have had commercial success to an extent. And I'm going to run through, using the singles and album charts of the US and the UK, representing the English-speaking world, those album and singles charts, to demonstrate the commercial and widespread popularity impact that these bands would have had by being part of the zeitgeist, by being music that was actually heard and consumed voluntarily in a widespread fashion that people actually enjoyed. Another criterion would be that these would be bands who progressed with their sound through the 60s, such that there is a lot of material there, whether it did have commercial success or it didn't, that by 1969, these are bands that were engaging with psychedelia, were engaging with more progressive pop sounds, more complex sounds, deeper lyrics, and had material, whether or not that material did have the commercial success or not, that is valuable to you as the psychedelia fan, as the garage fan, as the heavier rock fan, as a fan of, you know, nuggets officially, or more casually using the term nuggets, gems out there that might be missing. And I think in these cases are almost always underpriced and readily available in the market and belong in your record collection. This is going to be a series of 10 videos. This first video, I'm going to make the case for these 10 bands as being commercially important and commonly listened to, that they were heavily consumed, that they were a big part of 60s music from the perspective of being commercial successes and what people were actually listening to. Your average teenager, early 20s person at the time was not listening to Trout Mask Replica or the first Velvet's album. That's not so much what was going on for most people. And that's even true of most musicians. That's not broadly what most of them were listening to either. There are obvious impacts that the Velvet Underground and Captain Beefheart and all of our other favorites had, that we look retrospectively back on the decade and say, oh, those are the stars. But there's a lot of good material that came out that's looked at as being a little more lightweight, and I think that's unfair. So in this video, we're going to look at that first count of being lightweight, which was, oh, nobody really much liked them anyway. We're going to prove that that's wrong with the numbers. I'm going to run through all 9 groups, and we're going to go through their singles and chart success and show what a big impact that they actually had, and how popular these groups actually were, and why it's unfair to write them out of the histories of 60s music and the critical appraisals and evaluations of 60s music just based on that alone. And then I'm going to do a series of 9 videos after that, which are each going to individually go band by band. We're going to look at these releases as the 60s go on, that may not have the same commercial appeal, sometimes they did, but which are, to this day, undervalued, I would argue underpriced in a lot of cases, readily available and belong in your record collection, so that you can hopefully make some good additions to your record collection. I was a guy who was willing to, in the 80s and 90s, go to the record store, and it was a candy store. I mean, record stores are still candy stores, but a big difference is in the 80s and 90s, pretty much everything was there. You could go to the record store with a shopping list, a well-stocked used record store with a shopping list in your head, and go to the section, go to the letter of the alphabet, and find 1 or 12 copies of the record that you were interested in listening to. And things were in his pick through, and not only were things not as pick through, but they were a lot cheaper. We're talking about $2, $3, $4, $5 in a lot of cases for stock standard stuff that ended up in my record collection because I was old enough to catch that period when a lot of boomers were dumping their record collections. People were moving the CDs. The record store shelves were overflowing, and things were relatively cheap. And there were a lot of people who didn't want vinyl. The 80s and 90s were a golden age for stocking your record collection with the basics if you wanted to learn rock history. And that's something I did. So you could profit if you're perhaps not as old as me. You can profit by my experience on that end, and we're going to do that. I know a lot of these lists are usually 10. Here's my top 10 because we have 10 fingers, and there's the 10 commandments, and people like top 10s. I wasn't going to force a 10 if I couldn't happen to think of 10. I happen to think of 9. If you think I'm leaving somebody out as I run through these, you leave it in the comments for me, and that's maybe something I could do a video of in the future, or you could do a video of. Nothing's stopping you. Let's start with a band that I think is criminally underrated, and which the critical appraisal of which just is sort of lacking, and I find disappointing. If you're interested in garage rock and you're interested in edging in the psychedelia and that sort of thing, why doesn't Paul Revere and the Raiders get any love? I know they had the outfits, the costumes. They started back in 1959. They start getting on the charts in the early 60s. I think 1961, 62, they start getting singles in the US charts in the Hot 100. But let's look at what they did from 1965 through 1969. Paul Revere and the Raiders had 14 top 40 singles in the 65 through 69 period, 2 of which went top 10, both of those in 1966. In terms of album sales, they dominated 1966-67. They had 5 top 40 LPs in 66 and 67, which a lot of us think of as being the heart of great 60s music. And 4 if you don't count a greatest hits LP. It's still 4 albums in the space of 2 hot years. And 3 of those albums went top 10 in 66, 67. Paul Revere and the Raiders were on TV all of the time. Paul Revere and the Raiders were on the radio all of the time. And they were at the record store and they were in people's record collections. I'm going to do, as I said, with them, as with all of these, I'm going to do a whole video looking at their catalog and looking at the underrated, underpriced gems. This will be another video, as I said, that you can pick up from these guys. Totally underrated group of the 60s. Stick with me on this one, folks. Chad and Jeremy. Chad and Jeremy, I know, are thought of as being a very lightweight act of the earlier to mid 1960s. I think there might be a little confusion sometimes between Chad and Jeremy and Peter and Gordon, who actually were a lighter weight act who did not do more interesting stuff as the 60s progressed. However, let's look at what they did in the US. 7 top 40 singles in the years 1964 through 66. They had 1 top 10. That's the 1964 track, A Summer Song, which reached number 7 on the charts. They had 1 top 40 LP in 1964. In the UK, they didn't do nearly as well. I guess part of their shtick was we're British, and hey, we're British doesn't play as well when everybody in the country is British. So they had 1 top 40 single in 1963 in the UK, which was Yesterday's Gone, which only hit number 37. However, what I'm going to do when I do my Chad and Jeremy video is we're going to look at their later material, which nobody wants. I got these for $2 a piece just within the last 5 years. I got these 2 albums for $2 each. And this is stuff that if you're into psychedelia and you're into more complex progressive pop and more interesting Baroque pop and so forth as the 60s progresses, we're going to talk about why you might want to look at the Chad and Jeremy. In third position, we have the Hollies. Now, the Hollies are rated. The Hollies, there's been a bit of critical reappraisal of the Hollies as having been a better band in terms of it's more substantive band than they tend to get a lot of credit for. However, I still think they are comparatively underrated and therefore make my list. And I still think there are a lot of gems out there which for some reason a lot of the psychedelia and mid-60s enthusiasts just don't talk about as glowingly. I'm not 100% sure why, but look at the damage that these guys did on the charts. In the US, they had 7 top 40 singles between 1966 and 69. 4 of those went top 10. No LPs charted for them in the US during this period, which is a shame, especially considering some of the more psychedelic stuff, which we will certainly talk about in the Hollies video that I'll have upcoming. But then in the UK, they dominated the UK. In the UK, during the Summer of Love, these guys were up there, they were competing with the Beatles. And we don't, at least in the United States, we don't talk about them in those terms. In the UK, they had 18 top 40 singles between 63 through 69 inclusive. They had 16 top 10 singles in that period. 16 of the 18 were top 10. Everything they touched turned to gold. They were King Midas in reverse. They had 8 top 40 albums in the years 1964 through 69 in the UK. Now, if you take away the greatest hits album, there's still 7 top 40 albums in that period. And there are, depending on how you look at it with the greatest hits, 7 of those went top 10 in the same period, 64 through 69, heart of the 60s, Folks, are we underrating the Hollies? We'll talk about that in the video upcoming. Turning from pure Britishness to pure Americana, it doesn't get much more American than the Everly Brothers. Now, the Everly Brothers dominated the charts in the United States 1957 through 62. They had 18 top 40 hits in the years 1957 through 62 inclusive. 18 of them, most of which are still listenable by today's standards because there was a lot of legitimate rock and roll in there. Most of those 18 songs went top 10. Just incredible. This is the reason that they're first ballot Rock and Roll Hall of Famers. Well deserved. In as much as anybody deserves the treatment that they get at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was, as we know, from the Sex Pistols' refusal to participate and sort of some of the detail we got about what it cost you to get in. But let's look at what the Everly Brothers, later in the 60s, they had 3 top 40 singles in the years 64 through 67. They did not have any LPs chart in the top 40 in the later 60s, although this, Chained to a Memory, and a couple of other albums did hit top 100. And I'm telling you, the Everly Brothers stuff, as you go through the later 60s and up until into the early 70s, up through 72, I think they may have released 2 albums in 72, if I recall correctly. But that stuff, if you are a person who talks up Sweetheart of the Rodeo and International Submarine Band and that sort of thing, not only were, with the exception of Sweetheart of the Rodeo, not only were more people hearing the Everly Brothers material in that period, but I would argue that their take on country pop, country melded with rock and roll and the rock and the pop that was happening in the mid to late 60s, I would take it over the International Submarine Band. I would take it over a lot of Graham Parsons stuff. And it's every bit, if not more, authentic in that the Everly Brothers are an actual Southern rock and roll act. There's awesome quality music of theirs that I think that we are neglecting from the mid to late 60s from the Everlys, and we'll cover that in the video that'll be upcoming just about their work. In the 5th position, this band, I am pretty sure, I've never counted, but I don't think I have to count. I'm pretty sure that I have more albums by this band than I have by any other band, and that's the Ventures. I'm not sure how many Ventures albums I have. It's probably about 15. They're all enjoyable. They're all enjoyable. Now, of course, the Ventures, things kick off for them in 1960 in a big way with Walk Don't Run, a Chet Atkins cover and the album with that title, and then they chart again with Walk Don't Run 64 and with the Hawaii Five-0 theme in 1969. The album Hawaii Five-0 also charted very highly. If we look at the numbers for the Ventures, they had just 2 top 10 hits in 64 through 69. They had 3 top 40 singles in 64 through 69. But they had 5 top 100 singles in the period 64 through 69. This is an instrumental band. They had 1 top 40, which was 1 top 40 LP, which was Hawaii Five-0, and many, many, many top 100 albums constantly throughout the 60s. They are perpetually on the top 100 album sales. Everything from a Christmas album to all sorts of rock and roll albums, to learning how to play guitar with the Ventures, to their association with Monterey Guitars. And I would argue that the Ventures are probably the band that caused more American teenage boys to pick up a guitar and start playing than any other band. I don't think that you get a lot of the music you have in the 60s and 70s and beyond without the Ventures. I think we're deeply underrating them. We are undervaluing their catalog, and I'm going to do a video looking at some of their best stuff and how you can fill out your collection with the abundance of Ventures albums that are out there. Next, we have another American band who I think get short shrift critically because they're considered lightweight, and I think some of that's a bit unfair. The Association. Now, we know the Association's hits. In the U.S., they had 5 top 10 singles between the years 66 through 68. They had 6 top 40 singles in that same period. So this is prime 60s. They're players on the charts. They had 2 top 10 albums one in 1966 and the other in 1967, and they had 6 top 40 LPs between the years 66 and 69 inclusive. That's including a greatest hits, so take that away. They still had 5 top 40 LPs in the heart of the cool end of the 60s. In the UK, they did almost nothing. I think this is part of the reason you kind of have to be a hit in LA, New York, and London for the critics to keep puffing you. If you want to get puffed, if you want to get fluffed by the critics, it's got to be on both sides of the Atlantic, and that's part of what's holding a band like the Association back. They didn't do much of anything in the UK, just as the Ventures did virtually nothing. They had 1 top 40 single, Time for Living, hit number 23 on the UK charts in 1968, and that was it. However, the Association into the later 60s, into the early 70s, did more complex music. They did music which, if you're a person who enjoys or is supposed to enjoy something like later Beach Boys or anything with complex vocal structures or Baroque pop, that sort of thing, you may want to check out the Association. They also had very thoughtful lyrics. I think they're underrated. We're going to do a video about them as well. In 7th position, I have a feeling people aren't going to like this too much, and maybe you may even some people might even stop watching the video at this point. But hear me out. Hear me out on this one. The Four Seasons. Yes, I know. The Four Seasons are considered they're coming out of doo-wop. They're Jersey boys. They're lightweight, however you want to put it. But let's look at, let me give you these numbers, and you tell me whether or not that you can do a history of 1960s music and leave a group that sold like this out of your narrative. Let's see if you can do that. Let's see if this makes any sense. They had 2 #1 songs in 1962, Sherry and Big Girls. And then in the period 1963 through 66 alone, they have 12 top 10 singles. In the period 1963 through 1968, they had 23 top 40 singles. They're dominating the charts 63 through 68 in the United States. They had 7 top 40 LPs between 64 and 67. Now, 4 of those 7 albums are really kind of more singles collections. But still, take those away. There's still 3 top 40 albums between 64 and 67. And they had 1 top 40, they had 1 top 10 LP in that period, 1964's Ragdoll. Then in the UK, they did a lot of damage there too. They had 9 top 40 singles between 64 and 67. 3 of those went top 10 in the period 64 through 66. And then, ironically, their most interesting album, which is going to be a lot of the focus of the video that I do about them, it was the 1969 album, Genuine Imitation Life. Their more interesting reaction to more complex pop, psychedelia and everything didn't chart in the US in the top 40, but did go top 40 in the UK, which had to that point been comparatively ignoring them as a singles group. There are also 2 wonderful Rhino collections of what are titled Criminally Underrated B-Sides by the Four Seasons that are also going to be a focus of the video that I do on them. I own both of those CDs, and there's really quality music on there. The Four Seasons did make an effort through the 60s to advance their sound and to mix success, but I think that the successes are good enough that some of their stuff belongs in your record collection if you're a fan of this type of music. So keep that in mind. We'll be doing a video about those guys. Our 8th group is another band that they're considered lightweights, and I'm not quite as sure why here, especially when you look at the damage that they did on the charts on both sides of the Atlantic, and when you look at the fact that a lot of their stuff is actually really rockin'. And that would be the totally forgotten, never talked about Dave Clark 5. The Dave Clark 5 were a massive portion of the British invasion. People say, I was going to say that you can't write a history of the British invasion in the US and leave out the Dave Clark 5, but people do it all the time. They just didn't exist. They're written out. You hear that it was the Beatles and the Stones, and then a few lightweight acts, your Peter and Gordon, your that kind of thing. And we leave out the Dave Clark 5. Did they do well in the mid-60s, entering into the late 60s? Well, you tell me. They had 19 top 40 singles in the US. 19 top 40 singles in the period 1964 through 67 alone. 8 of those went top 10. On the first week of January 1st, 1966, the number one song the first week of 1966 in the United States was Over and Over, a Dave Clark 5 song. You go into 1966, which is considered the big turning point of music in the 60s, the number one song on the charts is a DC5 song, not the MC5. Very few people, I love the MC5, very few people listen to the MC5. And the MC5 didn't have an impact on music for another several years after their first album was out. You start to hear, when you get 70s punk, you start to hear people that were listening to the Stooges and the MC5. But if you're talking about listening to distorted guitars, all of the time, the Kinks get credit for that with their stuff that came out in '64. But there's a huge amount of distortion and reverb and all kinds of crazy stuff going on DC5 hits that were in most cases bigger hits. And unlike the Kinks getting kicked out of the country, getting kicked out of the musicians union in the US and not being able to play in the US in the mid-60s, these guys could still tour, which meant that they still got radio play, which meant that they still had hits and were still influential on American garage bands and future psych bands. So the damage is incredible on the charts. 19 top 40 hits, 64 through 67, 8 top 10, 3 top 10 LPs in the period 64 and 65, and 8 top 40 LPs, 64 through 66, one of which is the greatest hits. So again, if you take that away, and this is a soundtrack, but it's a soundtrack that's entirely their music. Having a Wild Weekend was kind of their Hard Day's Night. So they did the entire soundtrack. It is basically a new DC5 album. They killed it. They had, you take away the greatest hits album, they had 7 top 40 LPs on the charts in the US between 64 and 66. And then in the UK, their success actually started slightly earlier there. They had a number one song in the UK with Glad All Over, which is a stomper in 1963, which did not chart in the US until the following year. Then they had 5 top 10 singles in the period 64 through 67 on the British charts. And that goes into Everybody Knows was a number 2 song in Britain in 1967. Summer of Love Britain, the height of the 60s. Dave Clark 5 had a number 2 song on the charts. 11 top 40 singles on the British charts, 64 through 67 inclusive. They had 2 top 10 LPs on the British charts, one each in 1964 and 65. And they had 3 top 10 LPs, respectively in 64, 65, and 67. The last in 1967, again, Britain's Summer of Love was the greatest hits. Dave Clark 5 doesn't really make it beyond that period. They kind of soldiered on for a few years, and I think 4 out of the 5 guys in the group left music by the early 70s, one of whom I think became a manager and producer. But in terms of performing music, they didn't really go on. There's no Led Zeppelin or Crosby, Stills and Nash that comes out of the DC5, and I think that's part of the reason that their 60s work goes underappreciated, underrated. We'll talk in the video that I do about them, about some of the stuff of theirs that you could put in your collection very cheaply, very easily available because it's sold like hotcakes, and good music that if you enjoy garage rock, that sort of thing, you're going to enjoy. Now, number 9 on the list, I saved for number 9 because if I put them earlier in the list, people would have stopped watching the video a while ago. And I think we just need to hear me out on this one, just like on Chad and Jeremy and the Association. Hear me out on this one. This is the lightest weight of the group, but hear me out. There's stuff here worth hearing. Number 9, let's give it up for Herman's Hermits. Now, I know, teeny bopper, lightweight, but consider, can you write a history of popular music in the 1960s in the US and the UK and leave out Herman's Hermits when you hear these ridiculous numbers? These are Beatles-like numbers. 17 Let me repeat that. 17 top 40 singles, 1964 through 68. 11 of those went top 10. They had 2 #1 songs in 1965 alone. 2. They had 5 top 40 LPs, 65 through 67. And they had 3 top 10 LPs, all 3 of those in 1965, one of which is a greatest hits. If you remove a greatest hits, if you're the type that doesn't count greatest hits albums, that's still 2 top 10 LPs in the year 1965. And the stuff progresses a bit in its complexity and quality. They're covering Graham Gouldman. When other people cover Graham Gouldman, it's genius and they're masterpieces. If Peter Noone, I know there were girls, teeny boppers are buying records because Peter Noone's on the cover. I understand that. He's a cutie, right? I get that. But as the 60s progresses, these guys are digging into more complex material. They released the album Blaze in 1967. They're covering Donovan. They're incorporating more interesting sounds. And listen to what they did on both sides of the Atlantic. Part of what's impressive about this is also true about the Hollies. The Hollies and Herman's Hermits had big chart success on both sides of the Atlantic with an overlapping, we could do a Venn diagram, overlapping but different groups of singles. There were hits in the UK for both of the Hollies and Herman's Hermits, which were not hits on the other side of the Atlantic, and vice versa. So they actually had something like, you're pushing 40, 45, edging toward 50 hits. The Hollies and Herman's Hermits, but they were split between different markets. It's really remarkable. For the UK, they had 17 top 40 singles in the years 64 through 69, but they're largely a different set of singles, which is amazing. They did have a #1 song, the #1 song in the UK in 1964 with I'm Into Something Good. They had 9 top 10 singles between 64 and 69, largely a different list than the hits in the US. 3 top 40 albums, which were 65 through 67, one of those greatest hits. And they did have their self-titled 1965 album was a top 10 album, went to #3 on the UK charts in 1965. So just from a success standpoint, from a what was actually on the radio in the 60s and what were people buying standpoint, Herman's Hermits definitely underrated. In terms of the quality of the music, I'm going to do a video about the later, mid to late period Herman's Hermits stuff that you can pick up very cheaply that has really quality music on it, which if these were unknown, if it was an unknown group and these were tracks that somebody picked up on Incredible Sound Show Stories, or it was on Fading Yellow or one of those other critically acclaimed series of either Sunshine Pop or various flavors of softer 60s pop or interesting light psychedelia, that sort of thing, people would say, this is genius. How is this not a hit? Well, some of it was a hit. You've just been ignoring it because Peter Noone's face was on it. So we'll be doing a video about that. So look for a series. I'm going to make a playlist of the upcoming 9 videos that I'm going to tack onto this one, where we're going to evaluate, not from the sales perspective, why these bands deserve to be reappraised as part of a history of 60s music. We're going away from quantity. We're going to tackle quality in the video that is going to be specific to each of these groups. So I hope you watch for that. Please like and subscribe and you won't miss anything. I'm trying to get the subscribers up. Only 1 out of 5 people watching the videos right now are subscribers. I'd like to see that go up, so let's work on that. Like it. Tell me who my missing number 10 is. Who is the number 10 group that I've left out of this list that is just, using the criteria that I laid out, is just totally underrated or gets short shrift in the histories of 60s music in the English-speaking world? Let me know. And I'll also let you know there is an ongoing issue with my access to the Google account associated with this YouTube account. I'm trying to work with Google to straighten that out and hopefully not have to abandon the channel and re-upload all the videos associated with my other Google account. I'm hoping not to have to do that. But if I do, I'll try and get a message out to all of my subscribers, which is not a very large amount right now, unfortunately, or fortunately for those purposes, so that we could stay in touch and you could keep watching these videos. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you look forward to the ongoing videos in this series. My name's Chris. Thanks for watching Punk and Paisley, and until next time, kids, keep on rocking in the unfree world.